Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the February webinar for the 2017 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. This is Chris Fultz from the National Weather Service Central Region Headquarters. Today's briefing will be a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Mississippi Basin, including the Red River, the North, and the Great Lakes drainages. Additional information and forecasts can be found online at www.weather.gov. The March webinar for the Spring Hydrologic Outlook is scheduled for Thursday, March 2nd, 2017 at 2:30 p.m. Central Time, and invites and webinar information will be emailed early next week. Today's presenters are Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Forecast Center, Brian Connolly from the North Central River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, James Paul from the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Grushel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. This webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access the recording early next week. All questions will be held until the end of the presentation, and should you have a question during the presentation, please utilize the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI. Let's go ahead and begin with our first presenter, Jim Knoll.
All right there. Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jim Knoll here at the Ohio River Forecast Center, and we're going to go through kind of a general overview, and then we'll be going throughout the different sections of the Mississippi drainage system to get into more details. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the slides now. And on the first slide that'll be coming up on your screen, it's a review of winter precipitation across the Mississippi drainage system. And what really sticks out is the above normal precipitation that has occurred since December 1st across the upper Missouri Basin into the northern plains and upper Midwest. At the same time, below normal precipitation is highlighted in the orange area and yellow area across the lower Missouri Basin and mid-Mississippi Valley. So there's kind of a contrast of normal to below normal precipitation across the central and southern portion of the basin. At the same time, above normal precipitation across the northern sections of the area. Moving on to the next slide, we're looking at winter temperatures so far across the U.S. in the Mississippi drainage system. We did start off with a very cold winter in early to mid-December across a good portion of the system, but since then it's been very warm, relatively speaking, and that's why you're seeing more and more of the area turning orange, and that'll actually become even more orange over the next week as we have much above normal temperatures, some 10, 20, even 30 degrees above normal in portions of the Mississippi drainage system. So the only area that's showing in green of below normal temperatures is really confined to North Dakota, South Dakota, and the upper Missouri Basin. Otherwise, we have experienced a warmer than normal winter across the Mississippi drainage system. That is being reflected on the next slide, which is the departure from normal snowfall since December 1st. The areas in yellow, basically along and south of Interstate 80, across Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, and into Indiana and Ohio. From that area south, we've seen below normal snowfall, and the areas in green, in contrast, across the upper Midwest and northern plains have seen above normal snowfall, especially in North Dakota. But again, a good portion of the Mississippi drainage system has experienced some of the top 10 least snowiest winters, for example, in Kentucky. Moving on then to our snow water content, or how much water is in the snowpack, comparing last winter at this time on the left image to this current winter on the right image. Again, not a lot of differences, except in North Dakota and northern South Dakota. That area definitely has more snow water content with all of the winter snow systems. In addition, the mountain snowpack is much more significant in the Rockies this year than it was at this time last year. Otherwise, really, from southern South Dakota across southern Minnesota and then into the Ohio Valley and points south have very little or no snow water content on the ground at this time, which, again, snow water content is one of the factors that we look at to influence flood potential across the Mississippi drainage system. Moving along to the next slide then, we're going to look at soil moisture conditions across the Mississippi drainage system. And what sticks out there is it's, again, a tale of two different things. In the northern basin of the Mississippi system, in parts of, say, the Wisconsin and Minnesota, and over into portions of eastern South Dakota, and then up into the the Red River of the North area, above normal soil moisture conditions, as well as into portions of even Montana. At the same time, at or below normal soil moisture conditions really dominate the central and southern portions of the Mississippi drainage system. The small image to the lower left is comparing at this time last year, so you can see that we really did not have much dry conditions across the Mississippi system at this time last year, where this year we certainly do have at or below normal soil moisture conditions in the central and southern sections, in contrast to that wet condition in the northern areas. We'll transition to the next slide, which then looks at taking that soil moisture and how does it look as in terms of the drought status. One of the big differences from this time last year to currently is in the big image there, you'll see we do have drought areas that have developed across portions of Missouri down into the Arkansas and Red River basins in Oklahoma and surrounding areas. At the same time, we still have some lingering drought in portions of Tennessee and the Cumberland, especially the Tennessee River Valley, and that was from that drought last fall. Moving along to the USGS streamflow conditions across the area. The big thing that sticks out is, again, reflecting all of the graphics from precipitation to soil moisture that we've looked at and drought conditions up to this point. You do see the orange and red dots across from, like, say, about Missouri into Indiana and southward down into Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana, indicating below normal stream flow conditions for this time of the year. At the same time, portions of the upper Ohio Valley into the Great Lakes and into the upper Midwest, you'll see more blue and dark blue dots indicating above normal stream flow conditions. One thing I do want to point out here is that part of that is because with the really warm temperatures that we've been having lately, we are getting some of that snowpack to release early, and that does influence these stream flow conditions by shifting that snowmelt up to an earlier time. Taking a look now on the next slide that'll come up on your screen, it's the Army Corps of Engineers total flood control storage that is available. And the big thing to highlight here is that in all of the divisions, MVD, LRD, NWD, and SWD, all of the divisions of the Mississippi drainage system, almost all of the flood control storage is available in case there was some big heavy rain events as we moved into spring. And we are running above average for the availability. So that's good news in terms of if there is flooding, the Army Corps of Engineers has a lot to work with. And we'll look at that in more detail as we move around to each of the RFCs. Now I'm going to shift gears from what basically the antecedent conditions or past conditions have been. And now we're going to take a look at what our outlooks are over the coming weeks and months from a weather perspective, and then we will transition into the hydrologic or river outlooks. Over the next week through February 23rd, we're expecting really light amounts of precipitation across the Mississippi drainage system as a whole. You'll see a lot of light greens to darker greens, indicating really a ½ inch or less of precipitation, much of that in the form of rainfall if it does occur. The one exception will be a significant storm system going across Texas and clipping the extreme lower end of the Mississippi system down in Louisiana, potentially an inch or two, maybe even a few isolated 3-inch amounts possible. As we move into the second week of our outlook, which takes us into February, very beginning of March, we are expecting the above normal temperatures to continue. At the same time, after the storm system here moves through the far southern Mississippi drainage system, it looks like the storm track in the second week will shift to the north, and we will get a system of rain and snow to move across the northern plains, upper Midwest, and into the Great Lakes. At the same time, things begin to dry out a little bit across the southern Mississippi drainage system. Looking further ahead on the next slide then for our new March outlook issued today by the Climate Prediction Center of the National Weather Service. It does look like there will be a little bit of potentially a reset in the month of March, where our temperatures won't be as much above normal as they have been the last 1 or 2 months. We do expect above normal temperatures across the southern third to half of the Mississippi drainage system, and the potential for maybe even a little bit of colder than normal weather to return to the upper Missouri and northern plains area. At the same time, we do expect precipitation possibly a little bit above normal in the upper Missouri Basin, as well as in portions of the Tennessee and Cumberland Basin and a little bit of the lower Mississippi Valley in the month of March. Moving along then to the March to May outlook, we expect that basically we will see a transition of that warming pattern that we had earlier in the winter season to resume again. And so after maybe a little bit of a reset, where it's not quite as much above normal temperatures in March, we will see kind of above normal temperatures return to much of the basin as we move into April and even into May. At the same time, we'll see some drying going on in the lower half of the Mississippi drainage system as we transition from maybe a little wetter pattern in March into April and May. But at the same time, in the upper Midwest and northern plains, we are expecting the chance for above normal precipitation in that region. So how does this all look in terms of the drought outlook? Well, we're expecting some drought to persist in portions of the Tennessee Valley and extending into the mid-Mississippi Valley and maybe lower Missouri Valley. But there's a lot of uncertainty. Our confidence at this time of the year is not high in this outlook. So it's not clear if this drought will improve all that much or maybe even worsen a little bit. So right now we're just kind of holding the ground that we expect some of this drought condition in the mid-sections of the Mississippi drainage system to linger into spring. Now we're going to go ahead and transition from the weather climate perspective of the outlook to the hydrologic or river outlook. This is a product here on your screen now that is available at weather.gov as part of our Advanced Hydrologic Prediction Service. This graphic here is a compilation of all of the river forecast centers together for the Mississippi drainage system. And this is an outlook that extends through April. And the main highlights here is, just like we saw in all these past conditions leading up to this, plus the outlooks, is it looks like the primary focus for flood risk this early spring season will be confined or mostly focused in the northern high plains and upper Midwest and portions of the Dakotas and into Minnesota. This is at the 50% chance of exceeding our categories. So those orange categories would indicate minor flooding, the red would be moderate flooding, and the purples would indicate major flooding is expected at these locations. The green dots would mean that there's still potentially a chance of flooding, but it's below a 50% chance of reaching the minor flood level. You can see that there are scattered orange and red dots across the rest of the Mississippi drainage system, but in general, that's really a very common flood risk for this time of the year. So with that now, we are going to transition into each of the river forecast centers and get into more details on the flood risk. To begin, we're going to start in the Ohio River Basin along with the Cumberland. And the bottom line for the Ohio Valley is we are expecting some minor flooding across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky this early spring season. But the flooding is not really outside of the normal. You don't see any dark reds or purple dots. It's all green and orange. Basically, normal flooding that we typically see pretty much almost every spring season is expected across the Ohio River Valley. This would include some of our more significant basins like the Wabash and White Basins in Indiana and on into southeast Illinois, the Green and Kentucky basins in the state of Kentucky, as well as the Muskingum and Great Lakes drainage systems in the state of Ohio. On the next graphic, you'll see a green and red line. This is a volume total for the Ohio Basin down at the lower Ohio River. This is where all of the water comes out of the Ohio Valley. And the big thing you'll see here is the red line early on is below the green line, indicating below normal flows. And then at the end, as we move into March, a little bit above normal. But if you average it all out, it's pretty close to normal for this time of the year in the Ohio Basin right into March. So to wrap up the Ohio and Cumberland Valley, we are expecting minor flooding scattered across the Ohio River Valley this spring, but this is very typical for what usually occurs in the Ohio River Basin. Therefore, flood risk is considered normal for the Ohio Valley. With some lingering dryness in the Cumberland Valley in Tennessee particularly, we are expecting a below normal flood risk for the Cumberland River Valley, including the Nashville area for this upcoming early spring season. And as usual, rainfall and thunderstorms will really be the driving forces since we do not have really any ice or snow cover to speak of in the Ohio Valley and Cumberland Valley this late winter season. And so with that, now I'm going to go ahead and transition it to Brian Conley from the North Central River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start out by showing a map here of the snow water content that we are simulating in our models right now. I'd like to highlight the high snow water equivalents in northern North Dakota, especially in the Souris River Basin in north central North Dakota, moving eastward over the Devil's Lake Basin and the northern Red River of the North Basin. We are seeing snow water equivalent numbers in there from 3 to 5, even 6 inches in that region. Moving on to the next slide. Here we're seeing a different representation of that data. We're basically looking at the current simulated water equivalent as a ranking in the historical simulated record. And what I wanted to point out here, especially again, is in northern North Dakota, the current simulated water equivalent is in the upper decile of our historical simulated record. So it's a very significant snowpack. Moving on. Now, as Jim alluded to earlier, we are expecting quite a warm-up in the midsection of the country here over the next few days. From about February 17th to the 22nd, we're expecting some very warm temperatures to be occurring over the southern edge of our snow-covered region in the north central U.S. So we're actually starting to issue operational snowmelt forecasts based on this forecast warm-up. This particular map is an example of the high temperatures for Monday, February 20th. But we're going to see similar high temperatures throughout that period. Moving on, the next slide. So I'd like to start out by kind of zooming in on the Mississippi Basin and the Great Lakes Basins in the north central U.S. and talk about the flood outlook here. Starting out in the headwaters of the Mississippi, in the central part of the state, we do have an above normal flood risk there, and that's due in large part to the heavy precip we've had in the winter and the wet antecedent conditions that Jim alluded to earlier in one of his graphics. So there's a good possibility of minor to moderate flooding in that part of the basin. Moving downstream into southern Minnesota and Wisconsin, even northeastern Iowa, we're looking for a slightly above normal flood risk. In this area, although we've had above normal precip over the winter, some of it fell as rain, and a lot of the rest of it either has melted or is going to melt here in the next few days. So the conditions are very wet and leads to this slightly above normal flood risk. And then that flood risk continues downstream along the Mississippi River down into Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri, where minor flooding is a good possibility. Elsewhere, like in the Great Lakes region in Michigan and northern Wisconsin, most of Iowa, we're looking for just a normal flood risk. And we still may get some flooding in those areas, but right now there's less than a 50% chance of that happening. Moving on to the next slide. Here we're zooming in on the portion of our service area that flows northward into Hudson Bay. And on the far left here is the Souris River Basin, where we're seeing a much above normal flood risk for this area due to the heavy snow cover and the wet antecedent conditions Moderate to major flooding is a strong possibility in this area. Similar conditions exist in the northern portion of the Red River Basin along the Minnesota-North Dakota border. Also, these conditions exist for, there's a closed basin in this area called Devil's Lake. Devil's Lake is about 27 feet higher than it was in 1993. It's been steadily increasing, sometimes decreasing over that time. Due to the conditions, we're expecting at least a 2-foot rise in the lake this year, and there's a 20% chance of setting a new lake level record as well. So this is a place to watch. In the southern part of the Red River Basin, down in the Fargo area, we just have a slightly above normal flood risk in that region. We're expecting to start actually forecasting perhaps some minor flooding early next week based on this warm-up. We'll have to wait and see there. Moving on to the next slide. I just want to get a general overview of the frost depth situation across our area. As Jim alluded to earlier, we've had above normal temperatures over much of this area except for western North Dakota where it's been a little cooler. So frost depths are not that deep, especially in southern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and southward. In North Dakota, it's been snow covered for much of the winter, so that's prevented much of a frost penetration. We're looking at generally less than 20 inches there, which is below normal. So we're not expecting a big frozen ground year in these regions. Moving on to the next slide, we'll talk about the ice jam threat. It's been a very active year for freeze-up ice jams across Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, even as far south as Missouri. In the Mississippi, we've had freeze-up ice jams. Most of those have diminished and have moved on. And now we've got open water in much of the Mississippi Basin downstream of Lake Pepin in Minnesota, as is shown here in the satellite product, where the blue colors indicate open water. The cyan colors mean there's some ice cover. But for the most part, we've got open water on the Mississippi downstream of Lake Pepin and in the Illinois River. The USGS and Corps of Engineer personnel in the northern part of Minnesota and in North Dakota are indicating normal to below normal ice thicknesses in the rivers that they've been monitoring over the winter. So we're looking for basically a normal to below normal breakup ice jam season this spring. Moving on to the summary page here. So in summary, we're looking for above normal to much above normal flood risk in North Dakota and northern Minnesota, including the Souris, Devil's Lake, and Red River of the North basins, as well as the Mississippi Headwaters Basin. So moderate to major flooding is likely in those areas. And then we're looking for slightly above normal flood risk across southern Minnesota into Wisconsin and a little bit of northern Iowa, and then downstream along the Mississippi River. In these areas, minor flooding is likely at this time. And that's all I have. I'll pass it on to Kevin for the Missouri Basin RFC.
Thanks, Brian. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Kevin.
Okay, very good. Good afternoon, everyone. The graphic that you see before you here is a new product, and it's perhaps a little difficult to understand, but it's offered to convey the flood potential or the increase in flood potential for the basin. And generally speaking, we have a near normal risk for flooding in the west and across the south, and that includes much of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. And those are designated by the white dots. And what these dots indicate is not whether or not flooding will occur or won't occur, but it's the difference between the probability of reaching flood stage given today's conditions versus historic conditions. And so much of North Dakota, South Dakota, and western Iowa have a higher than normal risk for flooding this spring. And that's not to say that a particular location is actually projected to flood, but rather that a given location has a higher probability of flooding as compared to normal. Also toward Missouri, if you look down there, the cooler colors, the blue colors, that indicates that much of the state of Missouri has a reduced risk of flooding. Again, that's not to say that certain locations aren't expected to have flooding. Some indeed are, but they are at a lower probability as compared to normal. We'll move on to the next slide. Now we'll concentrate on the mountains. The left-hand plot shows the mountainous basin snowpack conditions in percent of normal snow water equivalent. That's the liquid amount in the snow. Mountain snowpack can be generally categorized this season as being slightly above normal. For the Missouri Basin above Fort Peck, we are a bit below normal. The Yellowstone is a bit above normal, and the Platte system, both North and South Platte, is above normal with regard to mountain snowpack. On the right-hand side, this is a graphical depiction of the February water supply forecast issued by our office on February the 3rd. It suggests that we have an average mountain runoff year, volumetrically speaking, for the Missouri above Fort Peck, a slightly above normal runoff year for the Yellowstone, above normal for the North Platte Basin, and near to slightly below normal for the South Platte Basin. That's in streamflow volumes coming off the snowmelt. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. This is a depiction of the plain snowpack, and as has already been mentioned, plain snow in the Missouri Basin is limited to the extreme eastern Montana, the state of North Dakota, and portions of South Dakota. Highest estimates are about 6 inches in the very headwaters of the James Basin. So the colors that you see there in yellow and orange, that's indicative of estimates of around 6 inches or so. We should start losing some of this in earnest due to the warm temperatures early next week. So my next 2 or 3 slides indicate, or this is probably what you really want to see, and that is the quantification or categorization of flood potential. And we'll move across the basin. We'll start in Montana and Wyoming. Widespread significant flooding from mountain snowpack is not expected this year, but we are expecting minor flooding in some of the tributaries to the Milk and Yellowstone rivers in Montana and along the Wind River in Wyoming. And those are the yellow brushes of color that you see there. So limited and minor as far as flooding in the mountains. Now we'll move with the next slide to the northern plains. We're indicating the yellow shading indicates minor flooding, and the red indicates moderate level flooding. And so in North Dakota, we're expecting minor flooding possible along the Cannonball, Beaver Creek, Apple Creek, and along the Knife River Basin. Moderate flooding is expected along the James and the Little Muddy in North Dakota. In South Dakota, we expect minor flooding along the White, the Big Sioux, and the Vermilion basins, with moderate flooding possible along the James River below the state line. In Nebraska, we have minor flooding possible along the lower reach of the North Platte River and along some of the smaller tributaries toward the southeastern portion of the state. We do have some concern over the Platte River itself below the city of North Platte, stretching into central Nebraska. Our long-range forecasts do not indicate the likelihood of flooding along this reach of the Platte. However, given the snowpack conditions in both the North and South Platte being above average, and also the reservoir conditions in the North Platte, we will continue to monitor with vigilance the stream conditions as we move into the spring and early summer along the Platte itself. So again, we are cautiously optimistic that we will not see flooding along the Platte River below North Platte, but we will monitor it, of course. Finally, in the state of Iowa, minor flooding is possible along the Floyd and the Rock Rivers, with moderate flooding possible along the Little and Big Sioux basins. And now we'll move to the very lowest end of the Missouri Basin, the states of Kansas and Missouri. As we showed in our first slide, we've got abnormally low soil moisture conditions have rendered an overall decrease in the chance of flooding in this area as compared with normal. However, even with that said, we do expect some flooding, i.e. there's a greater than a 50-50 chance for flooding in eastern Kansas and across the state of Missouri. Convection drives springtime flooding in the southern third of the basin, and we do expect moderate level flooding likely in the Grand and Osage River basins in the state of Missouri, as well as along the Tarkio and the 102 River in northwest Missouri. The Missouri River itself below Nebraska City may also experience minor flooding at a few locations this spring, and this is not atypical. So finally, with the summary table then, we do have slightly above average snowpack in the mountains. We have about 30% of the typical accumulating season left in the mountains, so things could still change. We do have an appreciable plain snowpack, but it's limited to North Dakota primarily. We do have wet soils in eastern Montana, North Dakota, and along the eastern portion of South Dakota and northwest Iowa. Ice jam flooding has already occurred, and in fact it's going on now in certain areas and will likely continue into the spring. Significant flooding due to mountain snow runoff itself is not expected, but we do expect minor to moderate flooding in the eastern portion of the basin, and convection, of course, drives the flooding in the very lowest portion of the basin. And with that, I will turn over the presentation to James at the Arkansas Red.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. Our first slide reinforces the drought monitor image that Jim showed earlier for the ABRC area. Much of the basin has been drier than normal since October 1st of last year. In particular, the southeast portion has received less than 50% of normal rainfall during the past 4.5 months. Our hydrologic model soil moisture condition map also shows this dryness quite well, with soil moisture levels in this area 30 to 70% of normal. Next slide, please. This image is courtesy of the NRCS and shows their estimates of snow water equivalent for Colorado. For our portion of the basin, we are well above normal at just below 150%. I'll remind you, most of the snowpack is in the higher elevations along our border, near the headwaters of the Arkansas River, and there's very little to no snow cover in far southeast Colorado. This snowpack should bode well for water supply, but right now we are not expecting an increased risk of flooding. For the Arkansas River headwaters, snowmelt typically occurs in early June. Next slide, please. And here we are showing the current flood pool storage availability in most of the Corps and Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs within our basin. Most have their entire flood storage available, and those that don't have at least 92% available. In fact, most of them are above 98%. They are all in good shape to capture any excessive runoff we may see from spring storms. And my final slide, our long-range outlook map shows a few locations with a greater than 50% chance of minor flooding, mainly in the eastern half of the ABRC. Most sites in this portion of the basin typically have a 40 to 50% chance of flooding during this period in any given year. If you dig down deeper on the AHAP's long-range flood map, you will see that most of these locations are showing a near normal chance of minor flooding. As a reminder, we can and do get flooding during times of drought, and any flooding we get will most likely come from springtime thunderstorm systems that do occur. With all that being said, the ABRC is looking at a near normal flood risk for the entire basin. Thank you, and with that, we'll go to Jeff at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
Alrighty, thank you, James.
looking at the soil moisture and the anomalies and stuff, just the same thing that Jim and James had showed earlier. The western portions of our area, specifically in the southern parts of Missouri, western Arkansas, and northeast Texas, are still pretty dry for the time of year with drought conditions. Also in the Tennessee Valley, specifically in western North Carolina and Tennessee that we forecast for, we continue to have drought conditions that have been lingering on since the fall period of time and really during the summertime as well. But basically the whole area, even the areas that are not circled, we really had dry conditions for most of the winter time period. And on the next slide, this is just the storage available that we have across our area. Just like what James had already mentioned, there's plenty of storage just about everywhere across our area. The area circled, actually they're in the 70 percentile of conservation pool, meaning that there's plenty of, they're not only at not at conservation pool, but plenty of flood control storage as well for any of those locations. So many feet available to allow those areas to take any sort of rainfall that we would get during the late winter and springtime. Next slide. Just the USGS maps kind of showing reflective of the drought conditions that we've been having in Arkansas and Tennessee and North Carolina. You can see that the graphic is showing below normal to much below normal for all those streams in those locations that are being circled. And next slide. And finally, really just taking the information from the Ohio River, the Missouri River, Mississippi, and the Arkansas River, we're really not anticipating any more than just a normal flood chance for the Mississippi and the Chapalaya. Just like with any event, we seasonally we will get some minor flooding on portions of the Mississippi and the Chapalaya, but that's really kind of just the normal seasonal flooding that we typically get on the Mississippi. Really don't have any more of an increased threat than what we typically have. Probably the areas that we have probably less of a threat of flooding just because of the soil moisture conditions and stream flow conditions are really in the Black and White and St. Francis rivers, and then really also into the Tennessee Valley, the tributaries going into the Tennessee River itself. Because of the drought conditions, we do have a less risk for flooding in those areas. But just like James had said earlier, any sort of really heavy rainfall that we get during the during the wintertime and springtime can generate some minor flooding. The rest of the area we're looking at just a normal flood risk, and you do see a lot of oranges and reds associated with the map, and that's pretty typical for our area to get minor and in some cases some moderate flooding at some of these locations. But that's really just the seasonal flooding that we typically get for late wintertime into spring. And that said, I will switch it back to Jim.
All right there. Thank you, Jeff. So we're going to go ahead and summarize this and then open it up for questions. And the summary basically is the main message here is northern areas of the Mississippi drainage system have an above normal risk, while the middle and lower sections have a normal risk, maybe slightly below normal in a few areas or just a few other areas slightly above. But again, above normal far north, normal mid and lower sections overall. In the details breaking it down, the red and the Souris above normal, upper Mississippi slightly above normal, as well as the upper Missouri, and then near normal across the Great Lakes, the lower Missouri, Ohio River basins, as well as the Arkansas and red and middle and lower Mississippi drainage system, and a below normal risk across the Cumberland River system. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris so we can go ahead and take any questions that you may have.
All right, Jim, thanks. At this point, we actually have no questions that have been asked, so if anybody does have a question, please quickly put that into the question box. Alternately, if you'd rather ask it via voice, raise your hand and I can unmute your line and you can ask your question. So I'll give just a few seconds here to see if there are any questions. And there was a question about whether the slide deck will be available online. At this point, the slide decks have been emailed out to everybody. There was a PDF that was sent about an hour ago, but if you did not receive that, certainly send an email to crhroc@noaa.gov, and we can make sure that you get those slides, as well as this has been recorded, as I mentioned early on in the briefing, and that recording will be available early next week. I'll send an email out to everybody with a link to where that can be viewed. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, as the reference there on the last slide showed, the next briefing will be conducted on Thursday, March 2nd at 2:30 p.m. Central Time. And again, the invites and the webinar information for that briefing will be sent out early next week as well. So if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and conclude the briefing for today, and we'll chat again here in about 2 weeks. Thank you very much, everybody.